I'm glad that you talked about the Wade case. I know you mentioned it before. Since you just addressed those factors, I want to just focus quickly so that the evidence that's presented today, we're all on the same page, and I think your bringing that up is very helpful. Prong 2 of that, evaluate whether it is reasonable to infer that the confidential information allegedly given would have been given to a lawyer representing a client in those matters. When I first read that, you know, I had to read that a few times to kind of figure out what are they talking about. What information is it? Information that, in this particular case, Gordon Silver would have received from George Benish, or is it information that George Benish would have received from Virgin Valley Water District? And the way I read the case, and it's borne out in the Wade decision, is would George Benish have received confidential information when he was representing Virgin Valley Water District? And that's what I think is very important to note in this case. And I think that goes directly to what Your Honor said with respect to not inquiring into the specific confidential communications that George Benish would have had with Virgin Valley Water District. We're not going to get into that. We're going to demonstrate evidence that he was involved in the 2 transactions that are at issue in this case, but we're not going to get into the specific communications because they're privileged. Right.
My thought is it would be nice if you told me specifically the allegations or the theories of civil liability that you have in this case, and then tie those into what you think Mr. Benish may have been involved with in prior representation. That would be nice to clarify that with me specifically, because at the end of the day, that's really the analysis that I didn't read into the record from 1.9.
Correct.
Okay?
Yeah, Your Honor, this case really is a case of 2 former employees of the Virgin Valley Water District essentially putting together 2 water transactions to benefit John Linetti and to benefit themselves. The allegations are that with respect to the 2005 transaction, Mr. Johnson primarily orchestrated a deal with Mike Winters, the general manager of Virgin Valley Water District, to cause the Virgin Valley Water District to pay John Linetti $3 million more for the water rights that the Virgin Valley Water District was purchasing from John Linetti. So that'll form the basis of our 2005 transaction. You'll hear evidence, for example, from Mr. Hathan. He was on the board. He was the president of the board at the time. He'll talk about that. He'll talk about George Benish's involvement in that 2005 transaction. Your Honor, you also have bills that are part of the exhibits that we've provided, which specifically show, without divulging confidential information, specifically show that George Benish was involved in the 2005 transaction. He was representing the Virgin Valley Water District on that deal. In fact, his own deposition testimony states that he believes he drafted the agreement, that 2005 agreement, which forms the very basis of our 2005 claim. Mr. Benish did that. The bills will bear that out, his own bills from that time period, as well as his own deposition testimony. The other transaction that's involved, Your Honor, is the 2008 transaction. Similar players. Mr. Linetti was the party who had the water. Michael Johnson and Michael Winters orchestrated a deal whereby that water would be sold to Southern Nevada Water Authority. Southern Nevada Water Authority did not want both of the 2 water rights that they were purchasing from John Linetti. I know that sounds strange, but this is how it went down. John Ensminger from SNWA has testified about this, that Michael Johnson presented the transaction to him. John Ensminger says, I don't want, you know, this certain water right, 54383, which is a number you will hear many times today, permit 54383. I don't want that water. The priority date on that water is no good to us. We can't use it. But we do want this other water permit that John Linetti has. So Mr. Johnson was obviously, and so was Mr. Linetti, interested in selling both of those water rights to SNWA. The total price tag on that was over $8 million. Those 2 water rights were sold. But because SNWA had no interest in one of those water rights were simultaneously traded to the Virgin Valley Water District. The problem with that transaction, Your Honor, is that the water that the Virgin Valley Water District got in that deal was $3.2 million. The reason that we know the exact value of that water is because that's the exact price tag that SNWA had just bought it for, from Linetti for. And water was traded to Virgin Valley Water District for irrigation shares that were worth over $7 million. And the way we established that is that SNWA issued a standing offer to purchase all irrigation shares in the Virgin Valley at that point for $80,000 per share. $80,000 times 89 shares is $7.12 million. Michael Johnson and Michael Winters presented this to the Virgin Valley Water District Board, you will hear, as this is a no-brainer deal. You guys need to do this deal that makes perfect sense. They gave no disclosures to the value of the water. The board members relied entirely on Mr. Johnson and his expertise in hydrology. He is the hydrologist, and so they approved the deal. Following the approval of that deal, all the parties, and I don't believe there's any dispute whatsoever on this, John Linetti paid Michael Johnson $1.3 million. That was paid through an LLC called Rio Virgin, and the evidence is that Michael Johnson and Robert Kochi were the two members of that LLC. Subsequently, $15,000 was given to Mike Winters. You'll hear evidence from the board members that describe that, so that's kind of the lay of the land of the two transactions.
All right, what if any, role do you think the evidence today will show that Mr. Benish played in this 2008 transaction?
Similar to the 2005 transaction, you will see billing statements from George Benish back in 2008 showing that he was general counsel for the Virgin Valley Water District. In fact, Your Honor, you will hear that George Benish was the Virgin Valley Water District's general counsel from the very formation of Virgin Valley Water District all the way through to 2009, and he handled virtually all of the legal work for the Virgin Valley Water District during that time period.
Okay, is that the extent then of the prior representation of Benish, you think, that's relevant to today's hearing?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into some details about how George Benish was having, thousands of conversations virtually with Michael Winters and Michael Johnson. I mean, yes.
All right, well, that then probably takes us, and you can go wherever you want, but at my guidance, I'd like to sort of suggest to you, at least initially now, is what's your evidence going to show that about Mr. Benish's current involvement in this case?
That's also shown substantially by his billing statements to John Linetti and the law firm of Gordon Silver. Specifically that June 2011 billing statement, wherein Mr. Benish describes the work he was doing for Gordon Silver and John Linetti. For example, Your Honor, I mentioned the permit 54383. You'll hear testimony about 54383, and what I'd like the court to keep in mind when you hear that testimony is their claim is twofold as I understand it. One claim is, well, George Benish was only helping with the lease. Yeah, Virgin Valley Water District was the other party to that lease, but that's just a lease. That doesn't have anything to do with this litigation. Your Honor, the problem with that is that the water that was the subject of that lease is the same exact water. It's 54383. It's the same permit that Virgin Valley Water District traded its 89 shares for. It's the same exact water. So they can claim all day long that's a lease and this is civil litigation, but the water involved there is the exact same water. All the information that Mr. Benish had relevant to that permit 54383, he had. And his billing statements clearly demonstrate that he was discussing that extensively. They discussed it by phone. They also discussed it in person. It was so important that George Benish traveled down to Las Vegas to discuss that.
Just to let you know, I have no idea as a judge what the water permits and 54383 and all that is. So if you could explain that
Sure.
Somewhere along the way through a witness, that'd be good.
Okay.
All right. Anything else?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's other evidence of what they were discussing. We're going to be presenting that, but yes, the substantial portion of that is shown through George Benish's own bill. The other thing we'll get into, Your Honor, is that the evidence will show that there was some intention to conceal this. This entire contact with George Benish, there was intention to conceal that. That was never disclosed, and Your Honor, the Virgin Valley Water District never would have known that.
What you mean? What are you saying specifically? Who intended to conceal it?
What I'm saying is, George Benish was involved in helping them in two facets. One is the lease. I've already explained that the lease involved the very water that's at issue in this case. The second thing is that George Benish, this is according to Mr. Gentile's own declaration, the other part was that Benish was brought in for help on the criminal matter. There was a criminal investigation going on at that time. Mr. Linetti was being questioned by detectives. Nate Chio, you read, or Mr. Giacomo read last time about his criminal complaint. There's language in there about Mr. Linetti being involved in a secretive and complex conspiracy related to that. Their claim, in addition to this whole lease deal, their other claim is that, that he was only helping on the criminal action. And our response to that, Your Honor, and you'll hear evidence, is that the criminal action and this action are exactly the same thing. They arise from exactly that same 2008 transaction. That, I mean, I don't know that there can be any dispute whatsoever as to that. You'll hear Mark DiGiacomo talk about it's the same transaction. You'll hear the board members talk about we're the ones that went to the district attorney and gave them the information on the 2008 deal. It's the same exact deal. So we don't believe they have any excuse for that. And then when we inquired, when we obtained a bill from the district attorney, this June 2011 bill, which we didn't know exist. We certainly didn't know that George Benish was helping the other side. We discovered that, and we contact them and ask them about it. You know, are you guys in touch with George Benish related to this case? And Your Honor, I hadn't seen the bill at that time. I had heard from our law clerk and associate, I think Mr. Gravitt, that they had discovered something that suggested that something like that was going on. I contacted them. Spoke with Mr. Dylan Siciliano, who will be testifying today, who we're going to call as a witness, that I asked him if they had discussed anything related to this case with Mr. Benish, and his response was no. And I said, go ask Mr. Gentile, go ask Mr. Zarnowski, see if they have. The response again was no. I sent an email to him saying, this confirms that you guys have never discussed anything with George Benish related to this case. He never responded, never disputed that, and we feel that there was an absolute purposeful concealment of their contact with Mr. Benish, which, Your Honor, if Mr. Benish was just some attorney brought in on some single matter, fine, but general counsel for almost 20 years, formed the district, and his own billing statement showed he was involved in 2005 and 2008. We don't see how you can possibly get around that. There's obviously a conflict.
Well, that's what we're going to figure out today. Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, one last thing, Your Honor. You will hear evidence about what a significant case this is to the Virgin Valley Water District. Mesquite and Bunkerville, there's maybe 20 to 25,000 people there. It's not a large community, but it's a very involved community, and that community knows what's happening in this case. From the very beginning of this case, this thing's been reported. There was criminal allegations and arrests. This thing was reported throughout, the Virgin Valley. It was reported throughout the state even. The Las Vegas Sun, the Review Journal. This thing's been all over the place. The Virgin Valley knows what's going on here. And one of the factors, as I understand it, it's not directly in weight, but it is a factor that's looked at, is what is the public suspicion of the public obloquy? Well, Your Honor, the Virgin Valley, not only is this a significant case affecting thousands of people and with millions of dollars, but it's also it's a case that the community knows about. And that if there's any decision ever in this case in favor of Mr. Linetti, that decision will be questioned. Well, why did that happen? Well, he hired, how can you go out and hire the former counsel of the water district and then expect that you can use that information and win? So you'll hear testimony about that.
Okay, I think it's a fair comment, and in fact, that's a factor. I'll grant you that. Okay, anything else?